Good. All right. Good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to this lecture on colour, space and evolving consciousness. And before I get into the slides, I'd just like to say that about this subject is that when I first began lecturing on it, colour and changing consciousness, must be maybe even 30 years ago, I used to give this lecture in terms of, well, this is how it is, this is the way, this is the way the world is, or the world was. A little bit the way after, at the same time, having, been 10 years out of my training, and, you're practicing an artist and you're teaching visual arts and you're being an art therapist, and you have this idea, as one does when you're young, that you know the subject, yeah? And in actual fact, as time has gone on and I've gone away, done other things, come back, done more with both colour and evolving consciousness, you gradually begin to realise that you really don't know half as much as you thought. And instead of having answers, you end up just by having lots of questions and things that you feel that, well, actually, I can't. It's not that I can't give a kind of an explanation, but rather I don't want to give an explanation, because as soon as one gives an explanation, there's a tendency to become a bit reductive. Sometimes I say this about Rudolf Steiner's colour lectures, that they're often translated as, in blue is the shining of the soul. And it's a bit sort of limiting. Steiner himself says we don't work with fixed concepts, we like to work with open-ended concepts. So the material I'm going to bring you on this subject tonight, or this morning, wherever you are, is really, I'd like you to take it as something open-ended rather than the way things are or the way things were. And I've set up this presentation in such a way that, in fact, hopefully it will stimulate questions and thoughts in you which you can share with all of us at the end of the session. So without any ado, I think we'll go into the slides. Colour, space and evolving consciousness, exploring the nature of consciousness in relation to colour perception and states of soul. So I think everybody is familiar with colour in the classroom or colour in the Waldorf school, and particularly it's hard to not, if you've worked in a Waldorf or a Steiner school, whichever you call it, it's hard not to actually think of colour in terms of the classrooms. Classrooms are painted in different colours, and these colours, if people are asked why the classroom's painted these different colours, the answer generally is, well, it's a picture of child development. The classrooms follow child development. Pinky reds in kindergarten, a brighter red for the slightly older child, moving into the oranges, yellows, green in coming up till 9 or 10 or 11, depending on your particular school's philosophy, and blue for the older children. And sometimes people also talk about it, oh, well, it's following the rainbow colours. And I put there, well, you need to think about which rainbow, because what we're going to see is what we think of as a rainbow, along with colours themselves, are not quite as necessarily as fixed in our perception or in general perception as we might think they are. I would actually even say that if you want to talk about colours in the classroom as following child development, there's also this idea that child development in Steiner's understanding of child development is, in fact, a kind of a microcosm or a recapitulation of human development. But that in itself is also open to question. I think it's almost safer to say that the classrooms in their colours will follow rather a feeling, moving from the will to the feeling to the thinking. the reddish colours for the very young child in they're still stimulating the will, the feeling for the child between 7 and 14, and moving into the cooler blues for when they're developing the capacity to think logically. Just coming back to that rainbow or into child development, Rudolf Steiner also uses colour, the rainbow, in his ceiling motifs in the Goetheanum, both the first and the second. And it also follows something of a rainbow sequence, but it's not the same sequence. So I just want to have a look at that. So this is actually a sketch that was done after the burning down of the first Goetheanum of the colour progressions with all the different motifs on the large cupola. And it will be very familiar to some of you. And unlike in the children's classroom, it doesn't start in the red yellows, it starts in the violet blues and goes through into the greens, into the yellow reds, where we see these motifs not in any particular order, dotted around, coming into these deeper reds, into the violets, and this ERO motif sitting there in a violet peach blossom colour. We have a side view, another impression here of what it might have looked like or what it did look like. You came in through the great doors and you walked down the hall and you followed the rainbow progression from the blues through to the yellows, reds, into the violet, and then into the small cupola. You don't have any such order of colours such as a rainbow. But certainly when we come to these, just in detail to look at those first two creation motifs, we see that Rudolf Steiner actually places the very earliest stages of creation of the earth and the human being in this deep blue violet. So this is the first motif, called the creation of the world by the Elohim and the Archai. Different levels of spiritual beings, streaming light forces down into the darkness of the earth. And then the second motif is this motif of the ear and the eye, also in these kind of yellow reds colours, but again embedded and surrounded by blue. Certainly when we go then to the later motifs, from the ancient Indian motif to the ancient Greek motif, those stages of what's often called the post-Atlantean epochs, then we can see there a connection of the states of consciousness of the human being with the ancient Indian human being, this floating in this red gold without any sense of being on the earth, and then coming into the next epoch, the old Persian, the ancient Persian epoch, and this sketch of the now with a sense of light and darkness, and the eye of the human being awakened by light, and these forces of darkness that the human being begins to grapple with. Coming into the ancient Egyptian, Egypto-Chaldean epoch, we then have also a greater sense of there being a kind of a sun, a light around, and a further development in the darkness with these sphinx and the mummified remains of human beings. And then we come into a kind of a sunny ancient Greco-Roman period, where the darkness that first appears in the ancient Persian and then into the ancient ancient Egyptian, then disappears as imaginative pictures and rather becomes this darkness of the abyss, of the underworld, which the ancient Greeks certainly absolutely dreaded. And we see this, those who know this sketch will know that this is the figure of Oedipus throwing down the Sphinx into the darkness of the abyss. So you could almost say that all of these four motifs are actually a picture of the battle of light and darkness, particularly not just the Persian one with these Ahura Mazda or Ormuzd as the, two different names depending on which version of Zoroastrianism you're looking at, versus the darkness, the forces of darkness, the god of darkness, Ahriman or Amen is another name given. But all of them, all four, are, you might say, here, the first one, there's an absence of darkness. Here, the human being, the eye starts to be awakened with light and experiences darkness as these Ahrimanic beings. Here in the ancient Egyptian, where the human being is becoming more deeply embedded in the physical world, there's a kind of an awakening to the idea of death, the reality of death. And then here in the ancient Greek world with this famous honey-coloured sky even, you might say, as the backdrop, then we have this abyss of darkness down now in the underworld. So one could actually say that this movement through the post-Atlantean epoch, certainly the first couple of stages, are a movement from light into darkness. However, when we look at the previous power sketches, Lemuria and Atlantis, that's Lemuria on the left and Atlantis on the right, there's no sense, any particular sense of them being any colours in relation to consciousness. It's just a great play of, often as we start to see how often blue itself is being used for spiritual beings in both of these motifs, just as it was back in the, scrolling backwards, we have this deep blue for surrounding the Elohim and the hair, or the darkness, you might say, of what looks like the hair almost, or the streaming behind the archive. So we see then with Rudolf Steiner's picture of human development, in contrast to this picture given of child development moving through, that it's a kind of a reversed rainbow. However, this brings us to what's sometimes called the tricky question of blue. There is, in fact, evidence that in much earlier times, people of the past did not perceive blue in the way that we do now. And when you first put that idea to people, often you met with a kind of a blank as to, well, if they didn't see blue, what did they see instead of blue? Or they might say, well, we can see blue in plenty of places in ancient architecture or in jewels. There's a famous sort of lapis lazuli stone that you see, as we saw in the very opening picture, the human being, the statue with those deep, deep, deep blue eyes. So what do you mean they didn't perceive blue? I can see blue now in their statues, in their architecture. However, when we're looking at perception, it's a rather what we perceive looking back and what people of earlier times perceived. It's not necessarily the same thing. And yet it's not just a question of saying, oh, well, they didn't see blue. But I want to go into that question a bit deeper. But first of all, I want to take a sidestep into an area of phenomenology, historical phenomenology. It's quite an obscure area, even amongst phenomenologists, and it's called metabletics. And metabletics is the study of the changing reality of things, or rather, reality itself does not change, but rather it's a human being who changes. So this person here is, he states, reality is but a reflection of human life. The human consciousness is what creates the reality we see around us. It's a kind of a way of saying, well, there isn't an objective reality, and yet we're not really saying it's all only subjective. He's not quite saying that. It's, again, it's not quite so straightforward at that. But metabletics, or this particular person, has a particular concept about the eye called the despotic eye. And we're going to look a little bit closer at an example of this, but this is just, you know, he talks about how the eye has followed the human being's development right back into the earliest times with the eye of Ra. And again, we see that blue eye. We see this eye, this all-seeing eye from the alchemists. We have then the eye, the all-seeing eye of Big Brother. So you can that will give you a bit of an idea of even of the date of when this article was written, because now we'd just say more, you know, we wouldn't say Big Brother so much. That was more when I was growing up. We talked about Big Brother. 1984 is something that was ahead of us. But we just more would talk about it being surveillance cameras. And then, of course, there's the inner eye, the eye of the mind, the third eye. And so the eye has followed us, he says, through our whole history as having this very significant role. And Rudolf Steiner also would agree with this. I must say that Rudolf Steiner never actually mentions anything about metabletics. It's actually a field that I think is developed well after he died. And it's interesting, just as an aside, having studied this area in my study of phenomenology, how quite a number of the ideas are quite similar. But anyway, I want to go on and look at an example given by metabletics as the shifting consciousness as seen through the eye, the perception that we have through the eye. And I want to show you these two paintings. I hope you can see them. Your screen is big enough to get a good look at them. The one on the left, as it said, is a painting of Florence, the city of Florence in Italy, round about 1359. And the one on the right is also Florence, but painted more than 100 years later, almost 130 years later. And I want you to look closely at both images, because I'm going to ask you a question about them in a minute. Take a moment to study each of them carefully. Think of yourself as the viewer. As the viewer, where are you and what are you doing, and why have we got these two? Why do we have two very different kinds of painting of Florence, 130 or so years apart? And in terms of the viewer, what is the difference? What is the difference in the two views? Anyone?
Well, the obvious is that the buildings are designed going vertical, and in the left side, the other side is far more spread out. That's just an obvious. It's hard to see in the right side exactly what the buildings are doing.
But why is that? Why is it hard to see?
Because it's a more expansive view on the one on the right. It's a broader scape.
Yes?
Can I say, so the one on the right is definitely like a fictional view. It's a bird's eye view. So I don't think there is anything physically high enough around Florence for you to literally look down on the city. So it's made up from knowledge of the map and the layouts of the street, but it's a fiction in that sense that it's a bird's eye view. Would that be correct?
Well, yes, you could say the one on the right is like a bird's eye view.
Yeah, and then the one on the left. So in that main building is it the baptistry?
I'm not sure.
The Duomo.
The
One? This one?
the whitish one with the sort of conical roof on the right hand side.
Oh, that one.
On the right
Duomo, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. Isn't that I just escapes me at the moment. Isn't that the baptistry? But I don't know that where that view would have been taken from. If it was sort of an observed, by an artist sitting there drawing what she saw. So that's possibly, unless there's a really high tower, which I can't think if there was one there. So they're both sort of fictional views or sort of schematic views in a way.
Anyone else?
Say that the one on the left is up close and intimate. It's a closer observation of immediate surroundings, whereas the one on the right is, as we've said, a bird's eye view. It's all distance. It's not intimate like the one.
Could be the eye of God.
What strikes me is that one you're looking up and the other you're looking down.
That too, yeah.
Anyone else?
One's more of an interior of the city and the other's an exterior. So it's that difference of...
Yeah. I want you to imagine for a moment you're in the picture. In the one on the left, where are you?
Down on the earth or in the city?
Yeah.
Be in the centre of the city, somewhere there.
In the centre of the city?
On the left, yes. Whereas the one on the right, I think you're actually out in the outer reaches, out past where the city finishes.
Or as Elizabeth quite sort of put it, it's like a bird's eye view.
Yes.
It's not a view. I mean, trying to think of how high a mountain must be or a tower must be to get a view like that. So it's not a view of which the person doing the painting can say, oh, I went for a walk today and this is what I saw. This is my experience of Florence, yeah? Think of them both in terms of experience. What is the experience of the person painting the one on the left?
It seems like the one on the left is trying to crush as many buildings into a small place as possible.
Yeah.
And possibly sitting on top of a roof because you can see other rooftops.
Yeah. I mean, when I look at the one on the left, I can practically hear the sound. I can hear the sounds of Florence just about.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. It's, it's all impressions crowding in on me. Whereas the one on the right, it's like, well, perhaps all if I'm a bird flying over. Yeah. But we're seeing these are not the only examples. If one looks at the development of Western painting, one sees this shift quite, it's almost like in terms of the history of humanity or in the history of painting, it's almost quite a sudden shift. Sometimes it's called the shift from naive perspective, where everybody's on top of each other and everybody's not the right, quantitatively the right size, and then there's a shift quite quickly to what we think of as spatial perspective. If you're talking about consciousness, what kind of shift has happened?
One, you're kind of part of it, and the other, you're a kind of a viewer, an observer. Does that
Yeah. Yeah. But why has this happened, do you think?
Because of shifting consciousness.
What? Sorry, Carolyn, what was that?
A shifting consciousness. But like we're all part of this there's a slight separation. Oh, okay, I'm seeing, I'm a bit more apart from it.
Yeah.
So on the left, you can see what the eyes can see directly in front of you, and the others are kind of an abstract idea.
Yeah. There's a kind of a distancing going on, isn't there?
Or an imaginary.
Yeah. It's like
escape.
A change in the relationship between the person doing the seeing and what's seen, between humanity and the world. And in metabletics, it talks about one is much more a felt or an immediate experience of the embodied eye, the eye that is present in the world of what is happening at that moment. Whereas the one on the right is the detached eye, what he also calls the despotic eye, the eye that, is the overseeing eye that is not part of the world, has separated itself in order to observe. So one is a felt experience and one is distance from the world. And this development of linear perspective, where a common horizon line passes through what is called in linear perspective the vanishing point. The vanishing point, where does this idea of the vanishing point come from? It has the effect of taking one out of the immediate experience and into a kind of, into your head almost, yeah? It's a separation coming about. And in Goethe's terms, he might talk about it in terms of the difference between a participatory consciousness and an observer consciousness. And anyone who's done any of the Goethean phenomenology courses or has read much on Goethean phenomenology or Goethean science will know about talking how in phenomenology, in the study, for instance, of nature, the phenomenologist is being asked to overcome the modern tendency to step back from the world and analyse it and observe it and extrapolate, and instead to go enter into the world, to step into it in this participatory consciousness, such as one might suspect that people of the far past lived much more strongly in that. In actual fact, we have this little woodcut from Albrecht Dürer, a woodcut from 1525, just a little bit later again. But it says, and this is a screenshot from the book on metabletics, about how Alberti in 1435 described this screen, and here we literally see Albert Dürer showing us this screen as a veil, a means of organising the visible world into a geometric composition structured on evenly spaced grid coordinates. and that the human being now sees, you might say, always through this detached eye, this veil, this organising veil, which, if one wants to really ponder this for a moment, is quite a major step in the shift in the human being. Now, obviously, it wouldn't have happened overnight, but the fact that you can see in the development of Western art, you can see this shift, suggests that people in the past had a different consciousness, a different connection to the world. Even when we look at this, you know, this voluptuous, half-naked woman lying there, you could imagine that by sitting back here, the artist, and looking at her, drawing her through a grid. And I don't know, sometimes, I don't know if any of you have done this, where you've wanted to copy a picture and you put a grid over it, and then each part of that's in the human being will fit into one little square. Yeah, it's a very kind of analytical, might say an analytical way of looking, but it kind of separates the drawer from that sense of not only the voluptuousness of the curves, but even the feel and the smell and all these other things of this half-naked woman lounging there, looking like she's half asleep or something. Yeah, it really is a removal, and we see this then in art, this gradual kind of distancing in the way that painting is portrayed up until about the late 1800s. I'm talking about in Western art. Then we start to see this world, you know, of Turner and Monet and Manet. It all starts to break down and move into quite away from this what's called realistic way of painting. But that's just an aside I wanted to bring to your attention before we go on and look at, back into colour itself. So consciousness and perception are, you might say, they are evolving, changing over time and space, according both to Rudolf Steiner and to metabletics and quite a number of other people. Perception was much more participatory in the past, and we currently, that is to say, in this consciousness soul state, we currently experience the world as separate from the self, isolated even from ourselves. And unfortunately, of course, what happens is that there are many modern assumptions about the past and also the future. Ignore the idea that perhaps people in the past didn't see the world and relate to the world, experience the world in quite the same way as we do. We look at the past and the future through our own eyes and assume that that's how everybody else in, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 years in the past and into the future will all see everything looking the exact same. And who can really challenge that? Well, let's have a look at the case for blue. If you're familiar with literature or culture, or even you might have just come across this term that Homer, the blind poet of ancient Greece, uses in the Iliad, where he describes the sea as wine dark. And this description, the wine dark sea, has had enormous attention in the last probably more than 150 years, actually. Many people trying to understand, scholars, philosophers, even I think a British PM, Gladstone, I think it was, wrote a paper on what did Homer mean by the wine dark sea. Is it poetic? Is it just imaginative? Was it that the sea just happened to look one day as if it was dark? Was wine different in those days? I've seen a wine dark sea, walking down from the hills of a remote Scottish island at sunset, and the red sky of the sunset soaked all the water, a wine dark. So is it just that he's referring to something that's a poetic idea? But when you look further, as quite a lot of these scholars did, you find that in fact there isn't actually a word for what we would translate as blue in classical Greece, in Homer, or not just in Homer, in quite a number of other writers. The word kionos, which is closest to it, we might associate with the term cyan, which is, if you might know, is actually quite a bright blue. But the way that it's used by Homer and others doesn't suggest anything to do with bright blue, or even what we would think of as blue, but more to do with a quality of darkness. Another quote from the Iliad: Hector was dragged. His Kianos hair was falling about him. Hector was dragged by Achilles. You know the story. And his hair, his Kianos hair was falling about him. Now, we don't think he was talking about that Hector had blue hair. And then there's another place. Thetis, who's a nymph, took up her Kianos veil, and there is no darker colour. And there are many other examples as well. And linguists have found that, in fact, what the term blue as we understand it, it's not found in Homer, it's not found in Aristotle, or in the Icelandic sagas, the Vedic hymns, or the Quran, which suggests that if there isn't a word for it, they didn't perceive it. Instead, the closest, this word kianos, not sure entirely how to pronounce it, but suggests some quality of deep darkness. There's also, it's not the only example, chloros, a word that we might associate with chlorine, a kind of a greeny, yellowy colour, perhaps, or certainly the green in plants. But in the ancient Greek writers, it doesn't so much describe a colour as a quality of freshness, you might say. Here's some examples. In the Iliad, chloros is used to describe resin or honey. It's also used by Pindar, a poet, to describe dew. In the Odyssey, chloros is used to describe a nightingale. In Euripides, an ancient Greek dramatist, probably a good 400 or 500 years after Homer, he uses the word chloros to describe blood and tears. So he's seeing something that what we might translate as being green is in actual fact seems to people of the far past to have had other qualities. Not that it wasn't necessarily what we understand as green, though the sky is often referred to as a kind of a honey-coloured, a yellow-greeny sky. Saw that in Rudolf Steiner's motif for the ancient Greek, but rather that it has qualities which we don't associate with it. These examples, I should say, both on chloros and on kianos, all come from a couple of places, but my main source is actually the work of Arthur Zajonc, who many of you will have heard me refer to in the past, who is an anthroposophical physicist. And he wrote a book called Catching the Light, The Entwined History of Light and Mind. And as a physicist, he goes into great, great detail, tracking. He's concerned with light rather than colour, but he takes the reader through the whole history of how the human being has understood light, both from its mythic into its historical and into the into the modern scientific understanding. And it's an extremely interesting book if you can get hold of it. But it also has this level of scholarship which shows that this isn't just a kind of a random examples, but rather, I mean, there are numerous examples he gives. We're going to look at some others in a minute as well, to suggest that what perception of colour means to us was very different to people of the far past. That somehow one might say that it was almost perhaps more participatory, that kind of the greenness of a plant or of honey, but also bearing in mind that even their idea of green sounds like it's rather different to ours, unless bees have changed the colour of their honey considerably. But then it's got these other qualities, as if one was much sort of able to also, in just looking at a plant or a resin or a nightingale, perceive qualities of life or freshness or dewiness or liquid also. It's like being a bit like that painter in Florence, or those two painters, one in amongst the bright colours and noise of a Florence day, and the other one who's removed himself or herself, who knows, from that immediacy of the environment and rather looks at it with that detached eye. What it suggests, according to Zajonc, is that the mind's eye is not passive, but active in seeing. So not just the outer eye, but our inner eye also engages in what we see. And in fact, he gives this, there's the actual quote down there, Arthur Zajonc, Catching the Light, The Entwined History of Light and Mind. He says that Plato talked about the eye of the soul and the mind's eye as being as active as the outer eye, in fact, possibly more active than we would think of it today. And this word theory, to behold, one of its older meanings, this seeing actively, not passively, by reaching out to grasp the world with perception. Whereas the modern science tends to see the eye as this more inanimate physical instrument only, rather than this active capacity of the soul to reach out and take hold of, well, not just colour, but we're talking particularly about colour in this webinar. Just an aside, I should say this is not from a statue from ancient Greece. It's actually a statue from ancient Sumeria of a priest. And they're quite famous, these statues of these very wide eyes with this lapis lazuli embedded eyes. But I liked the image, so I decided to use it. Let's just go to the Rainbow Bridge. The rainbow that we're so familiar with in Waldorf schools. Colours of the classrooms, the scarves, the rainbow paintings, the rainbows everywhere, particularly sometimes it seems like, I don't know, in Australian schools in particular, there's rainbows everywhere. We think of the rainbow as one of these, wonderful, wonderful experiences that can happen. We can see in the sky, well, not really, but certainly not as an everyday, and this lighting up of the colours of the rainbow we talk about. And the rainbow, though not necessarily by this name, excited people of the far past. We can see that from their fragments of their literature as well, but rather they talked often about it as being a bow of light. Also, not just as a phenomenon in the sky, but a pathway of souls to the upper world, a floating bridge of heaven, a way from heaven to earth with 3 colours. In the Edda, which is the Norse mythic cycle, Odin asks some hero, "What is the rainbow? Tell me what the rainbow is." And this hero says, "Well, it has these 3 colours, and it's this bow of light from heaven to earth." And these 3 colours Aristotle also agrees with. The 3 colours of the rainbow are red, which is the largest, followed by a yellow-green, like chloros, and the 3rd colour of the ancient rainbow, as perceived by Aristotle, was a kind of a violet or a purple, like a shade of darkness. So we see that the rainbow that we take so for granted as being so intrinsic to one of the mysteries of our world is, in fact, hasn't quite been the same itself throughout our history. And Virgil, Roman poet, called it 1,000 intermingled colours. So I'm just going back to blue. Blue, when one studies someone like Homer or Aristotle, or the idea of the ancient rainbow, according to him, seems to be more a capacity, a kind of a darkness, or a capacity, a kind of a shade of darkness. And one could also then suggest that for blue is more, to be able to perceive blue in the way we do today suggests a certain kind of inner state or a capacity of darkness within ourselves. And I just want to take an aside again into something not to do with colour and just go back to ancient Greece. So the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were written about the fall of Troy and all these hero myths, fall of Troy, they thought, was around about 1200 BC or before common time, as they say, more recently. Homer, about 300 years later, the blind poet, is the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. He doesn't write them down, however. In those days, they simply spoke their poems. Another 100 years later, we start to see that somebody does start to write them down. Another couple of 100 years later, you start to see in the development of drama in ancient Greece that these myths from the fall of Troy, from the stories told in the Iliad and the Odyssey, start appearing in plays. One of them about Orestes, who was the son of Agamemnon, who was the Greek who led the Greeks, or the Achaeans as they were called, who brought about the fall of Troy, and that 10-year war. Orestes, when Agamemnon came home, I won't go into the myth in detail, Orestes' mother, Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra, slew Agamemnon in the bath, this is, killing a member of your family was the worst crime you could commit in ancient Greece. And Orestes, in retribution, felt bound to kill his mother. And then he's, in the myths, in the stories, in the ancient dramas, then Orestes is pursued by the Furies, these mythical beings, or so-called mythical beings, these 3 terrible, terrible female forms who wherever he goes, he run after him, you might say, tearing at him and plucking at him, and he can never be free of them. And yet within a very short time or so, we find that instead of speaking of the Furies as being this external force, we have Orestes in Euripides' play the Orestes talking instead about conscience. To know that I have wrought a fearful deed, he says. This self-knowledge that what was once seen as some exterior force of, what's the word? Can't think of the word. Anyway, whatever the word is that you use when you're talking about judgment, that in fact it's more an inner voice now. And then there's this suggestion there that this ability, or the lack of ability to perceive blue as we see it, may in fact correlate to not having the same capacity to perceive darkness or inwardness in our own souls. If we go back to thinking of, I won't go back in the slides, we go back to those 4 slides from the post-Atlantean epochs, where Rudolf Steiner describes these post-Atlantean epochs in terms of light and darkness, rather than changing colour. And then Homer and others talking about blue as there is no darker shade. For them, what was darkness for us has become a colour that we associate with a kind of a turning inward, an inner soul, as a colour also to do with us being able to look into the distance, a spatial relationship. So where does this leave us? Where does it all going? Well, as I said, Homer's famous wine dark sea that has so puzzled scholars had them asking, and still are they ask, how did the Greeks truly see the sea? How did they really see colours? Is it just an emotional or an imaginative response? The Zajonc suggests in his in-depth study of light and darkness that it is to do with the perception of light and darkness, and that just as in the ancient Persian time, that colours are kind of a reflection of this mighty battle between the god of light and the god of darkness. Steiner also, in his colour lectures, speaks of colour as light and weight. One of his, you look at his colour lectures, they're divided, in the book they're divided into there's 3 which are to do with the image and lustre colours, and then there's another 3 which talk about colours in relation to weight and also in relation to their moral qualities. And instead of talking about colour in relation to light and darkness, one of this lecture he actually talks about light and weight. And that colours are in fact are a moral world within us, which will one day become a world of light. And in this particular lecture, he says, if we dip down into the body, we become inwardly psychic. That is to say, what I mean is we are souls and not scales. We become psychically sensitive to darkness in contradistinction to light. In this way, this is me saying this, not Steiner, one might say when one becomes psychically sensitive to darkness in ourselves, then we developed a perception of blue, and then, of course, having begun to talk about indigo, that is is something that the ancient Greeks didn't have. Which brings one back to the question, if the ancient Greeks did not, and others did not see blue, that they did not have blue in there, we don't find it in their texts. What does this say about their soul life, about their consciousness? And what does it say about ours? The development of our consciousness, not just in terms of changing colour, but in terms of changing light and darkness. So why is this important to us, other than as interesting information? Well, for one thing, in the arts and their mission, Steiner speaks about how colour perspective, in the artist, in the future, colour perspective, such as the artist used in the past up until the Renaissance in Western art, should replace the spatial perspective which it took over after the Renaissance. We should learn once again to paint out of this sense of not just colour perspective, but colour in relation to weight and light. But it's also more generally, more broadly, I wanted to bring this to try help bring this idea that we need to not get fixed ideas about what colour is. You know, not just that colours are not just fixed to objects, but beyond the set concepts that one can often find in Waldorf education or in painting trainings, that, oh, blue has this gesture, yellow has that gesture, we know what red is, we know what yellow and blue are. We don't have to, you know, it's kind of a set idea. It's very easy, I know, to fall into that idea that, well, I've done a bit of painting, I know what those colours are. And yet, when we look at the spiritual history, or we look at the perception of colour, how it's actually changing, then one might then have to just think about, well, what we're actually perceiving as colours in the world today is actually, in fact, something fluid, much more elastic and open to change. And for the future, Rudolf Steiner talks about how there are 5 colours that we don't yet perceive. Yes, at this stage in our evolution, there are 7 colours we perceive, those that we see in the rainbow, but in fact that there are these 5 colours we don't perceive, which if you try to sometimes you see people trying to paint this and it just looks like 5 shades of violet, you know, a warm violet to a cool violet. And yet, if it relates to our inner consciousness, our state of soul, then it could be that in the far future, these different 5 shades of violet may be as different from each other as we now think blue and green are from each other, or red and yellow are from each other. It was very important to Rudolf Steiner that without art as a lived knowledge, as an experienced, as a way of knowing from the doing and the continued doing and again, this constantly immersing oneself in colour and always deepening our experience of colour, that we can't really understand his colour lectures, particularly what he means by the moral qualities of colour, if we don't have this lived experience, so to speak. You cannot read the lecture on moral qualities of colour, I think, and actually really understand what he's talking about. Certainly, as soon as one works much more with this understanding or this felt knowing or this way of knowing colour through constantly working with colour, but an understanding that it's something to do with our inner state, our perception, our inner eye and our outer eye are not separate from each other, then we realise that we need to do far more work really to understand what is meant by the moral qualities of colour. It's just some of the references that I used. So there's the Zajonc, catching the light, and the despotic eye on metabletics, if anybody's, and Rudolf Steiner, the lecture on weight. It's in part 2 of Colour, the connection of the natural with the moral, physical, living in light and weight. So that's what I wanted to bring to you today, to, as I said, not to give any particular answers, but rather to try and open up our understanding of colour and colour perception and its relationship to our state, our inner state, as well as our outer perception. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts or questions that they would like to share with us now. Whether you just want to go away and ponder it. Well, hopefully you will go away and ponder it. Perhaps you'll even look up some of those references. But perhaps if nothing else, next time you work on your painting, you might ask yourself, yeah. Yes, Mark.
Fiona, I'm just thinking about the future and the future approach to colour, and how we've come from a participatory consciousness, and now we're in this kind of detached mode of consciousness. And does this indicate that we're going back to a more participatory consciousness?
Well, that's what Goethean phenomenology, or Goethean observation, as some people call it, asks us to do. It says overcome this separateness, this wanting to step away from the world, but consciously what the people in the far past had without thinking, or, it was about it. We have to consciously take hold of living into the world. This is what our plant observations and our immersing ourselves in colour to overcome this separateness from the world.
And how does that affect how we see the colour? In the future?
Well, I don't know how we'll see it in the future. If we look at how we saw it in the past, you see that there's other qualities. And yet I would suggest that anyone who's done some Goethean observation, this constantly returning again and again to one plant or the nature of plant, and starts to have this sense of they know the plant. And I know some people who've been in my conversations about garden, of course, have described this, that the plant starts to live in them in a way that they really do feel that their senses are not just limited to sight. Yeah? There's all unexpressible senses that one has about, one can start to, for instance, experience the life force in a plant, or the qualities of light streaming through the plant.
Okay, thank you. I must go. Thank you, Fiona.
Yes. All right then. I think it sounds like you'll like to go away and think about this. So
I've got a question, Fiona, just about it's Geraldine.
Yes.
I've got a question just about indigo, which is supposed supposedly the colour of the consciousness soul, and I'm speaking conceptually here because I can't say that I fully understand what that means, apart from that we've come from from what you've spoken here about coming from the reds, the magenta, the red, this evolutionary picture of the colour circle.
Yeah.
And that somewhere in there we are in indigo, which is a blue.
Well, is it a blue?
I don't know.
I would question whether it is a blue.
Or is it a red?
Maybe it only appears as a blue to some people. But in fact, you see, comes back to not getting stuck on ideas, theoretical concepts.
Well, that's why I'm asking, because a lot of what goes with exploring colour is the concepts of Steiner, of Goethe, and they're kind of givens.
I know, but this is what I'm saying.
I know you're breaking that down. That's why I'm asking about indigo. What from your experience?
Some people don't yet perceive indigo.
Mm.
But people who you show them indigo, what I might call indigo, they just see grey.
Wow.
And that in itself suggests that perhaps going back to Homer, or these others, what we see as blue, which for us is, we don't have just one blue even, do we? We have many blues, and blue can have a profound effect on our soul life, and yet it suggests that for people in the far past, maybe they saw blue as just as a darkness.
Mm.
The inner eye was not yet able to penetrate into the colour in the way that we naturally do because of the soul state. And this comes back to Rudolf Steiner talking about colour and science, and talking about, and also even someone who's got an article, I've got an article by someone who's got absolutely nothing to do with anthroposophy, who says, well, it seems to the ancient Greeks that light and darkness are qualities of far more importance to them than colour, but their understanding of darkness wasn't just an outer perception of darkness, that's, there's no light there, but rather it's a soul state which we have all I can say is we've penetrated that to the point where for us blue can take us into this great inner interior. One can live in a blue space and not see it as darkness or black or grey. So indigo, who knows, in a couple of hundred or so years, that indigo will have, you might say, look different to people of the future than what it does to us today. You see what I'm saying? It's like we tend to get very fixed about these things. Yeah. And especially, as you say, there's all these theories which everybody just, Steiner said it, so it must be right. I don't understand it, but Steiner said it, so it must be right. Yes. We take it on, well, Steiner said this. Yes, I know, I used to give lectures like that 30 years ago too. Yeah? But it's actually, he's always saying that's actually the worst possible thing you can do. You actually, the lived experience, the way of knowing that art brings, we're just talking about painting here at this point with colour, brings this inner soul experience that the intellectuality of the head can't grasp. I mean, for Steiner, like Goethe, the word theory didn't exist, because, or rather it exists, theory means, as I was saying, in its older term, to behold, not to abstract, but to behold, to take hold of. Goethe would say that, would say that the sky is, it's not a theory that the sky is blue and in the actual experience, the two are one. It's just that with our modern education, our modern way of seeing the world, even beyond education, we tend to theorise everything into kinds of concepts and think somehow that's knowledge. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm not sure I can even answer your question because, I'm actually trying to overcome this wanting to have answers, but rather opening up, becoming elastic in one's relationship to colour, to light and darkness, to what I call theory. Yeah.
Can be an opinion rather than an answer.
Well, I don't even have a particular opinion. I'm just presenting all these different
Fiona.
thoughts. Yeah. Yes, Chilla.
Will the sky be a different color in the future?
No, if the ancient Greeks thought it was a honey gold colour, and we think it's a blue colour, perhaps we will in the far future see a different. Because, see, as I said, it's to do with our inner state as much as our outer state.
Yeah. And how about peach blossom color? Is it one of the 5 colors we will see in the future?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is. These shades of peach blossom. But for us, it's still just this kind of, we're not even, Steiner says, we can't really perceive it yet. We're not sufficiently inwardly. It's not so much developed as our consciousness can't take hold of it in the way that it can, we can with blue or red. Yeah. So we just grope towards it with this exercise of painting red over fluctuating black and white.
I was really touched, really impressed, moved by the description of the cyanos and chloros, and that they were a quality of feeling, a quality of our consciousness. I mean, I know that's the Greeks and 2,000 years ago, but if I could walk outside tomorrow morning and experience the green differently, and to bring my consciousness of today to that, it's a little task I'm going to
look at green and experience the freshness, the dewiness of it. Yeah.
And the light and the dark and the bluishness or the reddishness or whatever, but that inner feeling for it, rather than seeing, oh, look, I'm looking over there and that's green.
Yeah.
You sort of feel into it and sense it.
Yeah. It's an awakening. It's trying to awaken other senses. And yet, again, in the far past, the senses didn't need to be awakened. They were more actively engaged. This exercise I like to give, which I call beholding, where I ask people to a hand coming out of the eye, so the eye becomes more actively engaged in the object rather than this, distancing kind of, oh yes, I'm studying it like that person painting Florence that he couldn't possibly have seen in that way, but abstracted as looking like that. Yeah. Anyway, we must wrap up. So hopefully I've left you with food for thought.
Thank you, Fiona.
Good night.
Thanks, Fiona. Thanks, everyone. It was
Bye, everybody.
Thank
you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.